You're listening to
and such a short amount of time to do it in. We were really
a Mamamia podcast.
The interview that you're about to hear today nearly didn't happen. I was this close to cancelling it, and it's really important that I tell you why. I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter, an interview podcast from Mamamia with people who tell their stories very candidly and aren't afraid to be vulnerable. It began a few weeks ago when I had my first COVID vaccination, and like lots of people, I marked the occasion with a happy selfie, which I posted to my Instagram. And in the caption, I mentioned how excited I was to be vaccinated and what a wonderful experience I'd had at the mass vaccination hub that I'd attended, and how lucky I felt to get my jab. About a day later, my Instagram and my Facebook pages were bombarded with abuse. There were hundreds of commenters on my post saying that I should die, calling me a whore, a shill, a medical terrorist, accusing me of being paid by the government or by pharmaceutical companies to promote the COVID vaccine to my followers. There were so many threats and so much abuse, and I'm going to be honest with you, it was really overwhelming and distressing. The weird part is how suddenly it happened. There had been nothing and then it was all on. That's when someone helpfully reached out to tell me that a well-known anti-vaxxer on Instagram, who posted incessantly about COVID conspiracy theories and shared a ton of anti-vax propaganda and lies. I'm not going to tell you his name because he'd probably love that. This guy had reposted the photo of me getting my vax on his own Instagram, and he'd told his 22,000 followers to go get her. And that's exactly what many of them did. For a couple of days, I had to close comments on all my posts, and I'll tell you, I was a bit shaken. It's intimidating when you're the target of an organised trolling campaign and so much abuse comes at you. And that's the whole point of it, to intimidate you into shutting down and shutting up. That's how the anti-vax movement operates. And it nearly worked. Before all this happened, I had already booked in the interview with the woman that you're about to hear from, Jane Hansen. She's an award-winning journalist who has reported on the incredibly dangerous anti-vax movement for more than a decade. Jane herself grew up in Mullumbimby, which is often described as a hippie town near Byron Bay in the part of northern New South Wales which is the power base of the anti-vax movement in Australia. Vaccination rates are lower there than anywhere in the country. And it was when Jane returned home after a long time working in Sydney back in 2009 that she learned about the tragic story of Dana McCaffrey. Dana was a local baby girl who had recently died from whooping cough, a vaccine-preventable disease. And it happened after there was an outbreak in the local community that her poor parents, Tony and Dave, who were fully vaccinated, as were their elder children, they were never told about this outbreak.
They had no idea. In fact, the vaccination rates were really low. There was no herd immunity, and the incidence of whooping cough was 12 times that of adjoining local health districts. And that's because so many kids were unvaccinated. I mean, my child went through Byron Primary and, not a winter went past where you didn't get that letter that whooping cough was about. It flies through that place. She was 3 weeks old when they took her to the hospital because they thought she had a little bit of a cough. And as soon as they got there, she went blue. And within a week, that child had died. And what Tony says is that she found out afterwards that she'd taken her newborn to a daycare centre where she was dropping off her older child, and afterwards she found out that 6 children had whooping cough. And she feels as though she walked her child into danger in a daycare centre, which is why she's been obviously so vocal about making sure that children are vaccinated, because children still die of vaccine-preventable diseases. They still die. I know that there were 3 children during that outbreak between 2009 and 2012. 3 children in that shire died.
As if that wasn't devastating enough, losing their newborn daughter, what some of the anti-vaxxers did was just shocking. they targeted the McCaffrey family.
Dana's death all of a sudden became an inconvenient truth. Meryl Dorey from the Australian Vaccination Risks Network went out of her way to try and prove that Dana died of something else. Now, the day after Dana's funeral, Meryl Dorey called Paul Corbin, who headed up the North Coast Area Health Service, demanding the medical records of Dana to prove that she'd died of something else. Now, I confronted Meryl about that. She lied about it because I've got an email from Paul Corbin saying, yes, she called me. And yes, I told her that Dana did die of whooping cough. But this is a modus operandi. This happens everywhere around the world with the anti-vaccine movement. If a child dies of a vaccine-preventable disease and a parent comes out to advocate for vaccines, they get attacked.
So that gives you a bit of a taste of the anti-vax movement. Tony and Dave McCaffrey are incredibly brave people because despite the unbelievable attacks they've received and continue to receive from anti-vaxxers ever since Dana died and ever since they spoke out to try and prevent any more babies from dying of vaccine-preventable diseases like whooping cough, they've kept going. They've kept speaking out. They've kept raising awareness about whooping cough and the importance of vaccinations in our community. And it's because of Tony and Dave and because I believe in science and I hate bullies that I started speaking out against the anti-vax movement too. And it's something that we've done here at Mamamia for more than a decade. So back to Jane and this episode. I thought about pulling it, I admit. I'm not proud of myself to admit that. But in the end, cover your ears, children. I thought, fuck it. This is too important. There is too much at stake here because since COVID, the anti-vax movement has gone next level. They've recruited a whole new army of supporters who are willfully spreading lies and misinformation on social media and influencing hundreds of thousands of people who may be on the fence about getting the COVID vax. And until more people get vaccinated, we cannot be free of lockdowns. I'm recording this with a mask on just after hearing that I'm about to go into lockdown for 7 days because of an outbreak of COVID in my area. We cannot open our borders as a country. We cannot plan holidays and see loved ones and get back to something that resembles normal life until the vast majority of our population are vaccinated. So this episode has two halves. The first is my conversation with Jane about anti-vaxxers. But I'm not a health expert. I don't purport to be. And Jane is not a health expert either. And nobody should take health advice from either of us or from anyone who isn't a health expert if it differs from the advice of scientists and doctors and health authorities. So in the second half of this episode, I've called up a professor of epidemiology to answer some basic questions about the COVID vaccine and to address some concerns and some myths. You'll hear from her later, but first, I wanted Jane to explain how the anti-vax movement works, why so much of it depends on money, and how celebrity chefs and supermodels have become staunch anti-vaxxers. Here's Jane.
Can you tell me a little bit about the Byron Shire?
Well, I'd only just moved back there in 2009 after spending my 20 years penance in Sydney. But I grew up there. My dad had the car dealership in Mullumbimby, Mel Hansen Motors. And when I was growing up in the 70s there, it was very conservative. You know, it was a farming community, a dairy community. An abattoir was running out of Byron Bay. It stunk. You didn't want to live there. And then, of course, there was the Aquarius Festival that just brought in alternative lifestylers.
What was the Aquarius Festival?
It ran out of Nimbin, and it was the hippie movement that was in response to the Vietnam War. And, you know, they came up to Nimbin and, you know, it was verdant, beautiful, great for growing marijuana. And, you know, I remember learning in school that marijuana had actually recovered the economy in the Byron Shire in the 70s because the dairies closed down and there were droughts and, you know, it was a cash economy there for a while. You know, that changed the entire vibe of the place.
By the time Dana was born, vaccination rates in the Byron Shire were about a third of what they were on average around the rest of Australia. 3 babies in 2009 alone died of whooping cough because there were outbreaks in the Byron Shire and in other places. Can you tell me a little bit about the AVN? They used to be called the Australian Vaccination Network, but people like you and me for a long time campaigned for them to have to change their name, because when you Googled vaccination in Australia back then, around 2009, after Dana died and before, they seemed like they were a credible source of information, didn't they?
In fact, in a midwifery book, there was a referral to them for information about vaccination. I mean, that's now been fixed, thankfully.
Talk about a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Yeah, they had this veneer of respectability. In fact, Meryl used to lecture at Southern Cross University.
Wow.
So they really slipped in under the radar. And, the way that they chipped away at vaccination confidence has really worked, obviously, in the Byron Shire. It's got this huge echo chamber now where it's almost embarrassing to admit that your child is vaccinated. I mean, I've got a niece that lives here who's had children, and because she sends her children to daycare, they go, oh, so your child's vaccinated, right? And she's like, we can't even discuss this. Such is the stigma around being vaccinated. So, the AVN's had a lot to answer for, in fact, in driving down vaccination rates.
I want to ask you more about Meryl and the AVN in a second, but I wanted to ask, with COVID, we've seen this mass proliferation of the anti-vax movement and into areas, it's not a fringe movement anymore. It's come into wellness. It's come into these mainstream figures. There are supermodels. There are celebrity chefs that are spruiking this rhetoric. What's the common through line of thought by all these anti-vaxxers? Is there one? Like, what are their values? What are they worried about?
It's a belief in a conspiracy that doesn't even make sense. So Pete Evans, Andrew Wakefield, Meryl Dorey, all these people believe that there's this giant conspiracy that all governments who don't agree on anything else, all governments across the world, all journalists, all medicos, all scientists are in on this giant conspiracy to pin kids down, stick them full of toxins for the sole purpose of making Big Pharma wealthy. Doesn't make sense on any level. But that's what they all believe, and that's what they all perpetuate.
I must have missed my invitation to those meetings where everyone got together and planned that, because I've been a journalist for 30 years. I think you have been about the same. So just so I understand, the conspiracy is by vaccinating people and preventing them from getting sick and dying, somehow that makes more money than having everyone sick and selling medicine for the sickness. That seems a bit counterintuitive.
And also, I think Sherry Tenpenny says it's actually a depopulation tool. The mental gymnastics on that, I just can't understand it. In fact, that's the big one going on with COVID at the moment, that it's a Bill Gates depopulation tool to have everybody vaccinated against COVID. It's lunacy.
It's also deeply paranoid, isn't it? This idea that everybody's working together for this secret, common aim that is unclear.
What's really interesting, though, because you and I are both journalists, we know a scary story sells. But if it's not true, it's not true. But people want to believe in evil, I think. I think it's a lot more sexy a message than, oh, here's a vaccine, it'll save your child from dying. It's much more interesting to have this delicious storytelling that there are evil forces out to get you and me and to harm our children and to create autism, and, all of those conspiracies have been tested, actually. The amount of money that's been thrown at the autism link with vaccination, would have been much better spent supporting, children with autism or trying to find out the real cause, which, is more or less becoming genetic in its source.
Let's talk about the godfather of the anti-vax movement, a man called Andrew Wakefield, who happens to be the boyfriend of Elle Macpherson, but we'll get to her in a second. Tell me about Andrew Wakefield and how this vaccine autism myth came about, because it was actually quite deliberate.
Yes, 1998. I'm actually old enough to have reported on it back in the day, and we were shocked. This was the medicine, the medical community coming out of the Royal Free London saying there's a link between the MMR vaccine and autism. Vaccination rates dropped. All parents went okay, I'm going to think twice about vaccinating my child. The confidence in vaccination was really seriously challenged.
Because the MMR vaccine is the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine that you get at how old do babies get that?
12 months.
Right.
Yeah. So over the years, little bits and pieces came out, thankful to a journalist called Brian Deere, who saw that it looked a little bit similar to the tetanus scare that had happened in the 70s. So he FOI'd the legal aid data on these 12 children that were suing the vaccine manufacturers. And that's when he found out that Andrew Wakefield had been enlisted by the lawyer for these children. There were 12 children, 8 of them had autism. A lawyer had approached Wakefield and said, I'll pay you £150 an hour to do this study, which he agreed to on the quiet. Nobody else knew. And in fact, at the end of the study, Andrew Wakefield had pocketed the equivalent of 700,000 Australian dollars to do this study. But this lawyer also dictated the terms. Like, for us to qualify for free legals, we need to find that there is a link.
Is that normal for a lawyer in a litigation against a drug company to commission a scientist or a doctor to do research with an outcome that he'd already determined that he wanted?
I'd say it breaks every ethical rule in the book, doesn't it? But further than that, I mean, the Wakefield protocol was really harmful to children. It involved really invasive tests. One child's bowel was perforated by sending scopes up the colon. Some parents afterwards said, well, hang on a minute, my child was showing autism traits before the MMR vaccine. Another father said the dates were moved. So this paper fell apart under pressure, which is why he was struck off the medical register. But on top of that, he was offered by his university the opportunity to do a gold standard double-blind test of his theory. He turned it down. Moved to America and carried on his anti-vaccine advocacy, which he earns now millions of dollars for.
How does he earn millions of dollars when he's been so widely discredited?
He gets paid by chiropractors. He gets funded by philanthropists that are anti-vaxxers, rich philanthropists. He sells his movies, docudramas, shockumentaries for, $30. His movie Vaxxed cleared $1 million for him, and the making of it was funded by other people. So, he makes money out of it.
What's interesting to me about him more recently is that the intersection of him and now his girlfriend, Elle Macpherson, which she keeps reasonably quiet. Like, if you follow her on Instagram, which I do, she doesn't publicise the fact that Andrew Wakefield, the most famous anti-vaxxer in the world and someone who's widely discredited, is her partner and has been for a number of years. And she's also moved from, she used to sort of have a lingerie label and do these things. She's now very much in the wellness space. She sells wellness supplements, and that's what she spruiks on her Instagram. That intersection between wellness and anti-vaxxers and Instagram and this sort of beautiful aspirational Insta lifestyle, can you tell me about how that's developed over the last few years? Because she's a pretty good example of that, even though she hasn't. Has she come out and specifically said she's anti-vax?
No.
She's been very careful, hasn't she?
Yeah, but she's the guest presenter each year at Doctors Who Rock, which is an outfit put together by the producers of Vaxxed. And the awards don't go to normal doctors. They go to people like Del Bigtree, the producer of Vaxxed, Andrew Wakefield, Vaxxed the movie. I mean, it's an anti-vax outfit, and she's a guest presenter each year for that. But, that wellness intersection, if you're selling supplements, one of your biggest audience is going to be those who believe in natural immunity. They're the ones that are going to be buying all the supplements. They're the ones that naturopaths and chiropractors spruik as, you don't need vaccination, you just need to be well and keep your health, boost your immune system. You need to take all these supplements. I mean, it is everything that they accuse Big Pharma of, making money out of selling fear.
And that's something that your documentary looked into, is the money that's involved in the anti-vax movement. Can you tell me a little bit about how, people like Taylor Winterstein, can you tell me a bit about her, who she is and where she plays into the whole anti-vax movement?
Okay, so she's a footy wag. She's married to Frank Winterstein, and she's an influencer on Instagram, but she's the same thing, selling the wellness idea, but also selling supplements and selling podcasts and natural health training sessions and courses that she charges, $70 for a course, but she's sold like hundreds of them. And, she boasted that she made $70,000 from one particular course that she ran the year before last. But she's targeting mums. She's targeting new mums, which are really vulnerable, and saying, take back your power. Here, buy my course and I'll teach you how to take back your power, which is basically don't take vaccines, take lots of supplements. Plus, she also gets a kickback she went to the same nutritional college that Pete Evans went to, did a 12-week course or something. And for everybody they recommend, they get a kickback for that. It's multi-level marketing.
And they also then can call themselves, what do they call themselves?
Nutritional coaches?
Yeah. They're their qualifications. It's like a 12-week online course, isn't it? Can we talk about Meryl Dorey for a second? Because she's such an interesting figure. Can you just tell me a little bit about Meryl? You've crossed paths with her a number of times.
Well, she's a macadamia farmer, so she has no health qualifications. She's done a lot of Googling, I suppose, but she's given up her life to do this anti-vaccine advocacy. During the COVID last year, she was running around in the Vaxxed bus with her team of volunteers, interviewing people.
This is a bus that had the word vaxxed written on it.
Yeah, and so Vaxxed is the movie that Andrew Wakefield went to America to produce after he was shamed in the UK. He went to America and he produced this shockumentary called Vaxxed, which was based on this CDC whistleblower who wasn't really a whistleblower. He just lamented that a small cohort of African-American children were left out of a study into children with autism in Atlanta, Georgia. And they were left out for a very good reason. African-American children were under-vaccinated at that time, and to qualify for autism services, they had to be vaccinated. They had to have a catch-up vaccination. So, of course, all the African-American children in this particular daycare centre were vaccinated because they had to be to get in, but they had autism first. So he was lamenting leaving that out of the study, which is a confounding factor. The waters are muddied if you leave stuff like that in. So he lamented that to Brian Hooker, who tape recorded it. And so Wakefield used those recordings to make this entire documentary about how the CDC had covered up the fact that there was a link, his link again, to MMR and autism. He was just flogging his own dead horse again and scaring people. But he made about $1 million out of that. It was controversial at the time because Robert De Niro, who had an autistic child, wanted to plug it at the Tribeca Film Festival. Interesting enough, Robert De Niro was in his 50s when he had his child. And one of the biggest predictors of autism is paternal age. So that was ignored, but had to be the vaccines. But anyway, that documentary or shockumentary is just so full of scary children, heartbreaking scenes of children with autism. And if you weren't scientifically literate and you watched it, you'd think, oh my God, what a cover-up. But of course, it'd be on the front pages of every newspaper if it was actually true. The fact is, it's not true. There's a perfectly good explanation as to why that data was left out. Just getting back to the Vax bus, Meryl has the Vax bus and she's driving that around Australia. She was last year. They're making their own documentary of people's stories about vaccine injuries. So people are going into the bus and saying, I reckon I was vaccine injured. I reckon my child was vaccine injured. And the devastating thing about that is it's so exploitative. And there's a fair bit of grief porn going on with Meryl. So she gets people who have lost children and, maybe to sudden infant death syndrome, which we know now is mostly because of unsafe sleeping. A lot of children are smothered, a lot of children overheat, or infants. But if you were a mother and your child died of unexpectedly 2, 3, 4 weeks after vaccination, of course you're going to question vaccination. But you've got to look at the baseline. Vaccination has reduced the level of SIDS. The rate of SIDS is higher in an unvaccinated community than it is in a vaccinated community. It's just ridiculous to think that there would ever be a system that would kill children and that people would cover that up. But that's what she runs with that. It's her ideology, and it's just an ideology. It's not backed by science. She cherry picks, some outliers like Sherry Tenpenny and Andrew Wakefield, and they have this echo chamber where they all back each other up, basically. And it's terribly compelling if you're a new mum and you walk into that.
And Jane, why do you think she does this? Does she have a child that she claims was vaccine injured? Like, what's her worldview?
She says her son was vaccine injured, which I questioned her about that. And she said, I'm not going to tell you because you have no compassion, Jane. Well, apparently he's a fully grown adult now and very well, according to other family members. But she wouldn't disclose what the vaccine injury was. I mean, I might say there are children that do react to vaccines. In a small group, they can have febrile convulsions, which is terrifying. But most, all recover, basically.
And there are adults who react to vaccines too. We've seen this with the clotting and the AstraZeneca.
Yep. And that's fully reported, 0.004% risk.
In fact, I would argue it's over-reported. Many journalists and doctors believe it's over-reported in terms of overstating the risk rather than covered up. I've been thinking about the anti-vaxxers during COVID as the vaccine's been developed and thinking that it's almost like all their worst predictions are coming true. There's vaccine centres, new vaccines are coming out, everyone's getting a new vaccine. How are they losing their minds? Like, how are they going?
It reinvigorated the movement. The noise online went through the roof. And, it was in a way a perfect storm for them and a perfect stage to exploit fear of the unknown. And, there's all these new groups that have come on board now, like Reignite Democracy Australia, and they're all basically anti-vaxxers, and QAnon, and they're all anti-vaxxers, exploiting fear. But, this is really going to test their resolve. Like, most of us are going to get the vaccine. I think 60 to 70% of us will. And, if they can't travel anymore, I wonder how many will put their hat on and dark sunglasses and sneak off and quietly get the jab.
I have a friend who's a GP in Mullumbimby, and she said when no jab, no play and no jab, no pay was introduced, which was when the government, I think you were very much part of that campaign that was, led by the media. Can you explain what it was?
One, it was inspired by Meryl. She was my muse. But Claire Harvey and myself, we were so annoyed with the amount of misinformation that wasn't being challenged by the media, actually. And vaccination rates back in 2012, 13, we launched that in 2013. Vaccination rates had dipped below 90%. And in some areas, even in Sydney in the eastern suburbs, it was lower than third world countries. And obviously, anti-vax chiropractors and naturopaths and, the anti-vax movement were making their way, via social media and Facebook, making their way into people's decision-making and, it threatened children's lives, frankly. So, we suggested no jab, no play for childcare just to raise the bar, just so that parents had to go and get their information from a doctor about vaccination, not from Google. And that, that's been part of a raft of things that the government has taken on. It's got its own life now. And as well as your Save the Date app, vaccination rates for 5-year-olds are now over 95%. And that's just extraordinary. No child has died of whooping cough since the Rileys pushed for the maternal whooping cough booster. No child has died of whooping cough since. That's just proof in the pudding.
My GP friend in Mullum said that when no vax, no jab, no play and no jab, no pay, so when vaccination was tied to welfare and rebates for childcare, suddenly a whole lot of people who'd been anti-vax came in and got their kids vaxxed. So she said that was really interesting, that if you were that committed to your ideology and you believed that vaccines were going to injure your child, surely the incentive of a few bucks wasn't going to make you sell out your child if you truly believed that. And she said it was astonishing the difference that those campaigns made and that legislation made.
Well, it is an ideology and people pin their identity to it. And it's not based in fact. You and I have looked for those facts to try and see, could we possibly be harming children through vaccination? And then you go look for the support for that. It's not there. It's just not there. In fact, the opposite is true. To think that we would run with a lie like that is just ludicrous.
And then you've got the people saying it's about government control and Bill Gates and microchips in you.
I see that you're 5G enabled now that you had your vaccination the other day.
I'm stoked. If it means I get a better Wi-Fi, I'll be into it. What was interesting when I recently got swarmed and trolled by the anti-vaxxers was I clicked on a couple of the profiles of the people who were sending me foul abuse, and a lot of it was middle-aged women. It was mostly women. There are a few men, but mostly women. A lot of their profiles on Instagram were like love and light, and they were like holistic yoga practitioners. There seems such a contrast between, if they don't choose to get vaccinations, fine, but the abuse that they are hurling at those of us who do choose to get vaccinations and advocate for vaccination, how does that work, those two things together?
Yeah, well, there's no peace, love and lentils with these people.
No.
You and I have been on the end of them. It's the same thing. I don't have a problem with a person individually choosing not to get vaccinated with a COVID vaccine. I don't have a problem with that, the vaccine hesitant. I have a problem with the outfits that are pushing other people who want to get vaccinated, pushing them away from doing it. This is the problem, because it's like a war to them. It's like they have to win. I don't know what the consolation prize is. The consolation prize is that you will eventually get COVID. It's not going away.
So it's worth noting that Jane does not have any social media anymore because she was so relentlessly attacked and targeted by anti-vaxxers. I won't pretend I'm not wary because they are vicious. But let me just state for the record, Jane is not paid by the government or by pharmaceutical companies. I am not paid by the government or by pharmaceutical companies. We talk about vaccination because we are passionate believers in science. We are also passionate believers in protecting the most vulnerable members of our community, which is what vaccines do. So now you've heard about the anti-vaxxers. But just because you may have questions about the vaccine, that doesn't necessarily make you an anti-vaxxer. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that. So the second half of this episode is a Q&A session with Professor Mary Louise McLaws. She's an epidemiologist with expertise in the control of infectious diseases, and she also serves on the World Health Organization on their COVID response advisory panel. I'm sure you've seen her on TV. You'd recognise her face. She's often used by news organisations as an expert because she is one. And I wanted to ask Mary Louise to address some of the myths and the concerns about the COVID vaccine, particularly about how it's been made and tested and distributed so much faster than we've seen before with vaccines. It is fantastic and reassuring information, whether it's for you or whether you want to pass it on to someone else in your life who might need to hear it. Here's Mary Louise. I want to just talk about, first of all, the idea of people who are hesitant. We've spoken about anti-vaxxers earlier in this podcast, and I think you will probably agree that once someone is pretty far down that path of disillusion and misinformation, it's hard to get them back. But that doesn't necessarily describe the people who are in the middle. There's a group of people who are hesitant, isn't there? How would you describe those people?
Samia, absolutely. There are those who are early adopters, and then there are those who are anti-vaxxers, and then there's a group in the middle. And my work in patient safety, when there isn't an outbreak, I do patient safety work, and I've been using a theory called the theory of innovation, which is an old but very tried and true theory that basically says there are innovators like Steve Jobs. Then there are the early adopters that say, that sounds great, I'll have what he's suggesting. And then there are the later ones that wait for the early adopters to take on board whatever it is. And then there are the very slower ones, and they're the ones that are often labeled as hesitant. But I think that's unfair because they probably take a lot of time to make a life decision, be it changing jobs or, buying a house or buying a car or going on a holiday. They are the sort of people that like a lot of information before they start, making big plans. So we need to respect them and we need to understand what is stopping them from coming forward faster. But they probably will come on board. It's just we have a time limit because the government wants to open up the borders. And so I would ask this group that normally take time to make this big decision to think about making it earlier. Because if you're in the Pfizer group, the less than 60 years of age, it will take you 21 days between the first and the second dose. So you have to start, counting backwards. And then, of course, 14 days after your second dose, then you really are protected. So first dose, 21 days, second dose, 14 days. So you really need to start thinking about it a couple of months before the government is itching to open up the borders to make sure that you're safe.
There's a lot of complexity, I understand, in doing those numbers and working backwards. But the first thing I wanted to ask you about was this question of speed, actually, and this question about making a decision in a hurry. The biggest question that I hear people asking, people who are hesitant, is it's been approved so fast. How has it been rushed through, and how can it be safe when vaccines usually take much longer to be approved and go through years of testing? This has been basically developed and rolled out in a matter of months. How can it be safe?
Look, I understand exactly where they're coming from, because it does seem as if this has been at warp speed. The difference between this development and, say, the development for the human papillomavirus, for example, for the school kids, is that it takes a really long time to get participants, to get enough of the right age group or enough of the right gender balance. It can take years, because people have to be of those early adopters to want to put their hands up to say, okay, I'll be a guinea pig. This isn't being a guinea pig. The group that were the early participants in places like Brazil and Europe and England are basically tens of hundreds of thousands. That would normally take 5 to 10 years to enroll that many people. But because this is a pandemic and they can see in their country death and a lot of sickness and health facilities being overrun, they are so excited about potentially being in that right of what we call a randomized control trial, where they get the vaccine versus, not the placebo, the saline. And so it has been this a rapid enrollment of participants because the world has got involved in this. No corners have been cut with safety. The WHO have a log of all of the trials, and then there is an international one for all of the safety. Any trial that's been developed has been overseen by a group of experts in epidemiology for trials. That's a very specific type of epidemiologist. They won't let them cut any corners. And in fact, at WHO, on the committee that I'm on, we are often updated across the virology and the treatments and the vaccine groups. And we had last year and ever since many meetings with the group telling us about how the vaccines and the treatments were going. And they reminded us that even though some of these trials of treatments and vaccines were looking very positive, they were not going to stop the trial, because that would stop the public from thinking that there was enough safety. Because often in it, for example, a drug trial, if people are doing very well and it's an obvious fact that the drug works, they often can stop the trial early. But they decided they would not do this with the vaccine, that they would see it to the end of phase 3, because they wanted everybody to see that they were not cutting corners. So we know every single side effect that you could possibly get. And some countries, since they've rolled it out into the real world, are often better at telling their population about some of the side effects. For example, AstraZeneca in Australia, our government has been sharing with the people exactly what the risks are. And so it has potentially made people a little anxious. But you have to commend the government for sharing this information. So there's been no, shortcuts, none at all, and all of the safety trials have been followed to the letter.
Obviously, what you were saying about the AstraZeneca and the clotting issues and the health advice changing. So first it was over 40s should get it, then it was over 50s, now it's over 60s. If someone has a parent, perhaps, or if someone's listening to this who is over 60, and they're concerned about AstraZeneca, what's the best way to reassure them?
First of all, they should be very pleased that the government has listened to their concerns and has reviewed the evidence and responded rapidly when they've seen an increase in risk with the first dose. And certainly it would appear as if the first dose is much more risky than the second dose. It would initially appear as if women are more at risk than men, but because it's so rare, that's a very difficult decision to make, that it is more risky in women than men.
Because the sample size of people who've had problems is so tiny.
Exactly. And then certainly for the second dose, it's tenfold less likely to happen with the second dose. So I would say to you, if you've had the first dose of AstraZeneca and you're at all concerned, I'd say to you that you need both doses to be protected against any variant of concern or any wild strain. But if you leave it too long, instead of getting vaccinated with that second dose at 90 days or 3 months, if you leave it longer than 120 days, so 4 months, then you're potentially wasting that first dose because your body has developed a nice antibody response, what's called a priming, and that prime will disappear. And so you've got to go through it all over again. So please don't waste that first dose. Please go and get that first dose. The other thing I'd say is, now this is going to be hard to hear, but I think it's important to tell people exactly what they need to know. When you get that second dose, remember, you've got a very small chance of anything going wrong, but these are the things you need to be mindful of. If you have a persistent headache, and not just a headache because you're tired or you've been dehydrated, but it's a persistent headache over days. If you have stomach pain or an unusual rash or unusual bruising or blurred vision, go immediately to the emergency department, because in Australia, your ability to be able to be protected from death due to a thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome is enormously high, because our physicians in the emergency department are amazing.
They're primed and ready to
They are
recognise the
primed
symptoms.
and ready, absolutely.
And they know how to treat it.
Exactly. But I'm going for my second dose soon, but I'm slightly different in that I use numbers to help me make a decision, and then I use logic after that. So, for example, my husband, who is older than me, if I was concerned about his risk, I would first of all use the probability. It's low. He did well with his first one. He actually felt a little tired. After that, he was fine. People get pain in the injecting site, but you'd get that with anything, with Pfizer as well.
Yeah, I had that.
And then I'd say, what is his risk of death if he got COVID? And it's enormous, because he's in that age group where he represents the majority of people who died. So if you're over 60 or if you're over 70, it's really not a decision that you need to take lightly about not getting that second dose, because you have an enormous risk of death if you catch COVID. So anyone over 60 represents 98% of all deaths in Australia so far. So please protect yourself. The other thing I'd say to them is, at the moment in Oxford, they're doing what's called a mix and match or a heterologous study of the first dose AstraZeneca and the second dose Pfizer. They've identified that those that get the Pfizer for their second dose instead of another AstraZeneca have twice the likelihood of fever. They're not sure how important that fever is, how dangerous that fever is, but they also get a fabulous boost. But these are only preliminary data and they haven't been assessed for full safety. So our government won't encourage the mix and match. So you won't really have a choice, because they don't have enough information that's evidence-based to encourage you to do that. So please don't waste your first shot. Get the second shot.
Can I throw some of the myths or some of the more sensational claims that are being made by anti-vaxxers about the vaccine to you? The first one is that it affects your menstrual cycle. So someone saying, I had my vaccination and then I had a very heavy period. Can you explain the difference between something that happens one after the other and something that's caused by the thing that happened first?
That side effect has never been reported. So that's something that often happens to women anyway. I mean, it's a bit like, whenever I wash my car, it rains, but it doesn't mean washing my car causes the rain.
So true.
So it's just coincidence.
Whenever I wear white pants, I get my period. But it doesn't mean that the white pants brought on my period, did it?
Yes.
What about the question of infertility? That's another myth that's being propagated by those who are opposed to the vaccine, that it can cause infertility.
Well, I'm not sure what the pathway is for infertility. So there's no evidence that it gets into sperm or into any cells that make sperm or that make ovum, that make eggs. I haven't heard that one, but it's improbable.
Mary Louise, what about the microchips? What about the microchips in the vaccine? How do they get them in there?
They'd have to be really tiny, wouldn't they? Really, really tiny.
You can find many a video and many a person who believes that there are microchips in the vaccine that are somehow enabling, I think, the government to track our movements, but I think they're confusing the vaccine with Facebook.
Their Facebook or the Opal card or their credit card. Yes, so if you actually talk to some people who have been contact traced because they've had a casual or a close contact with a case of COVID, they'll say that the contact tracers can tell you where you've been shopping. They can even see you on CCTV in some of the shopping malls. So the government doesn't need to put in these microchips because they can follow us everywhere. I don't know if you've ever driven towards the Harbour Bridge, but I've counted how many times I've gone past cameras. Unfortunately, I usually leave my phone in the boot of the car because they don't want us to use the phone, quite rightly. And so they don't need to microchip me to see where I'm going and if my hands are on the wheel.
Just to be clear, can you put a microchip into a vaccine?
No, because every time you draw up an amount of the vaccine, you'd have to make sure that that microchip was drawn up as well, or it would have to be full of microchips, and it couldn't possibly be, because then you'd have a lot of side effects to this foreign body.
What about magnetism? It makes you magnetic.
Well, that's...
Bollocks?
That's difficult, yes.
I know bollocks is not perhaps a medical term.
No, that's very scientific. Yep.
How often are we going to have to be immunised, do you think? Is it going to be like the flu where there's sort of, a booster shot every year? What do we know about that?
Well, we don't know definitely how long our antibodies keep us protected after we have 2 doses. We certainly know that we're protected for potentially a year, but when there are nasty Delta viruses going around, the messenger RNA vaccines that the young will get with Pfizer or Moderna can be much more rapidly adapted, that recipe you're going to be injected into, to deal with any change in the strain. So you may get a booster if Delta decides to hang around for a long time and Pfizer or Moderna decide to adjust their vaccine so that instead of getting 88% protection, you'll get back to, the 90s. So, watch this space. We don't really know yet. But think about this. There are nearly 8 billion of us on this earth, and most of them haven't been vaccinated with even 1 dose.
What about pregnant women?
Pregnant women have been vaccinated in Israel without a problem with Pfizer. Mostly you will talk to your doctor about any medical issues that you have, but Israel decided that they were more at risk of getting COVID than any potential risk from Pfizer.
Mary Louise, Professor, thank you so much. I really think I hope that that's pushed a few people over from being hesitant to being ready, and that we have more and more people going and helping not just themselves, but helping the most vulnerable members in our community, which is basically what vaccines do, right?
Exactly correct. And look, we're not just doing it for ourselves or our family, we're doing it for Australia.
There's another conspiracy going around that people like you, people like me, are being paid by pharmaceutical companies, are being paid by the government. Look, I'm still waiting for my check to arrive.
I'm certainly not getting any checks. I have no investments, or I'm not paid by anybody, and my work at WHO is free.
Good to get that out there.
Yeah.
So there you go. I hope you've learnt more about the anti-vax movement, and I really hope it will help you recognise some of the propaganda and misinformation for the dangerous lies that they are if it drifts into your social media feeds, posted by one of your Facebook friends maybe, or someone that you follow on Instagram. The key is to ask your doctor if you're worried. Don't watch a YouTube video or read a meme and make a health decision based on that if it contradicts expert medical information. We all have a responsibility to look after each other, and listening to health professionals and not bloggers and not celebrity chefs and not macadamia nut farmers, that's the best way to do that. No Filter is produced by Lucy Neville. The executive producer is Elissa Ratliff. I'm Mia Friedman, and you can hear more from me if you want to subscribe to my newsletter. Just go to miafriedman.com.au.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land we have recorded this podcast on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures.